The heat inside Forward Operating Base Whiskey's Tactical Operations Center hit 115 degrees, even with the air conditioning running at full capacity. The Iraqi sun had turned the entire compound into a pressure cooker, but the real heat came from the silence in the room, where 6 Navy SEALs sat watching drone feeds that showed nothing but endless desert and the skeletal remains of abandoned villages. Commander James Blackwell stood at the center console, his face carved from stone, watching the seconds tick past on the digital display. 72 hours. In the special operations world, that number meant only one thing. Lieutenant Brennan Archer wasn't missing anymore. He was presumed dead. The typing came from the corner where Petty Officer Garrett Sutton sat hunched over a laptop, his fingers moving slowly across the keys. He wasn't writing mission reports or intelligence assessments. He was writing a eulogy for his best friend. The man he'd gone through BUD/S with. The man who'd pulled him out of the ocean when hypothermia nearly killed him during Hell Week. The man whose wife had just given birth to a daughter 5 days ago. A daughter Brennan would never meet. Lieutenant Brennan Archer, Garrett typed, his hands shaking so badly he had to retype every third word. Beloved son, husband, father, and brother-in-arms. The words blurred on the screen. Garrett wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of dust and salt across his face. Behind him, the other SEALs sat in that particular stillness that comes when warriors accept the unacceptable. They'd stopped talking about rescue 12 hours ago. Now they were planning how to tell Brennan's wife before the casualty notification team arrived at her door in Virginia Beach. Standing apart from the group, near the wall where the shadows gathered thickest, Colonel Victor Thornton watched everything with eyes that had seen 4 decades of impossible situations. At 67, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who'd spent his entire adult life in uniform. His hair had gone completely silver, and deep lines framed a mouth that rarely smiled. He wore the desert camouflage of a visiting advisor, but the ribbons on his chest told a different story. Bronze star with V device. Silver star. Purple heart with 2 clusters. A career built on doing what others called impossible. But even Thornton knew the math. 72 hours in hostile territory. No communications. Intelligence reports said Brennan was being held in a compound controlled by a Syrian insurgent leader known for executing American prisoners on camera. The nearest quick reaction force had searched for 18 hours straight and found nothing but sand and death. The odds of Lieutenant Brennan Archer coming home alive were effectively 0. You're giving up too soon, Commander. Thornton's voice cut through the silence like a knife through canvas. Every head in the TOC turned toward him. Commander Blackwell looked up from the tactical display, his jaw tight. Sir, with all due respect, we've exhausted every option. 72 hours in hostile territory. No comms. Intel says he's in the Syrians' compound, and we can't get authorization for a rescue operation. The risk to a full team can't or won't. Thornton's blue eyes were cold as Arctic ice. There's a difference, Commander. One's about capability, the other's about courage. Blackwell's face flushed, but before he could respond, a young corporal appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable about interrupting the tension in the room. Colonel Thornton, sir, there's a chief petty officer here requesting to speak with you. Says it's about Lieutenant Archer. Says it's urgent. Thornton glanced at the digital clock. 0347 hours. Nobody requested urgent meetings at 3 in the morning unless they were about to do something that would either save lives or end careers. Usually both. Name? Chief Kira Dalton, sir. Marine Corps Scout Sniper attached to the recon unit 40 miles north. Thornton's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. A memory trying to surface. The name meant something, though he couldn't immediately place it. He'd trained over 1,000 Marines in his career. Names blurred together after 4 decades. Send her in. The woman who entered the TOC 30 seconds later didn't look like someone who just traveled 40 miles through hostile territory in the middle of the night. She looked like someone who'd been planning it for the last 72 hours. Chief Kira Dalton stood 5'6" in her desert boots, her frame compact and muscular in a way that came from carrying 70 pounds of gear through mountains and deserts for years. Her brown hair was pulled back in a tight regulation bun, and her green eyes held the kind of focused intensity that made everyone in the room instinctively straighten up. She walked directly to Thornton, came to attention, and delivered the sharpest salute he'd seen in weeks. "Colonel Thornton, Chief Petty Officer Kira Dalton, Marine Scout Sniper. Permission to speak freely, sir." Thornton returned the salute, studying her face. Somewhere in his memory, a door was starting to open. "Granted." "Sir, I'm extracting Lieutenant Archer, with or without permission." The room went silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Commander Blackwell took a step forward, but Thornton held up one hand, his eyes never leaving Kira's face. "Chief, I've trained hundreds of snipers over 40 years. I've watched good ones die attempting stunts like what you're suggesting. What makes you think—" "You trained me, sir." Kira's voice was steady, professional, but there was steel underneath. "Advanced Scout Sniper Course, Camp Lejeune, 2004. I was the only woman in the class of 53 students." Thornton's eyes narrowed. 2004. The year he'd been brought back from retirement to revamp the Scout Sniper program after the invasion of Iraq exposed gaps in long-range reconnaissance training. He'd run 6 classes that year, each one more demanding than the last. He'd made it his mission to wash out anyone who couldn't meet the standard, regardless of political pressure to pass people who didn't deserve it. But he still didn't remember her. 53 students per class, 6 classes, over 300 faces that year alone. "I train 50 students per year, Chief. What makes you think I remember?" 1247 yards. Kira interrupted him, and something in her tone made every SEAL in the room pay attention. This wasn't the voice of someone asking for permission. This was the voice of someone stating facts. "Final qualification, wind estimation and compensation drill. You said it was an impossible shot for anyone under 200 pounds. The wind was gusting 15 to 20 miles per hour, crosswind from the northeast. You told the class that anyone who made the shot on the first attempt was either lucky or lying." The memory slammed into Thornton like a breaching charge. The range at Camp Lejeune, the wind howling across the flatlands, the target at a distance that pushed the limits of the M40A3. He'd set up that shot specifically to fail everyone, to teach them that some conditions required waiting, required patience, required knowing when not to pull the trigger. And someone had made it. First attempt, center mass. He remembered walking down to the firing line, certain the spotter had called it wrong. But the target confirmed it. A perfect shot in conditions that should have made accuracy impossible. He demanded to know who'd taken it. And when he'd reached the firing position, he'd found, "You're Dalton." His voice came out rougher than intended. "You outscored Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, class honor graduate. And you said I got lucky with the wind, sir." There was no accusation in her tone, just fact. "You told the class that exceptional results from unexpected sources should always be viewed with skepticism until proven repeatable." Thornton felt heat rise in his face, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who'd spent 40 years maintaining perfect emotional control. He'd said that. He remembered saying it, and he remembered why. A woman had just outperformed 49 men on the most difficult shot he'd ever designed, and instead of acknowledging exceptional skill, he dismissed it as luck. Because in 2004, he hadn't believed women belonged in Scout sniper teams. He'd believed they lacked the physical strength, the mental toughness, the killer instinct required for the job. He'd been wrong. But admitting that now, in this moment, felt like opening a door he'd kept locked for his entire career. "I may have been harsh in my assessment, The words felt like pulling shrapnel from old wounds. But that doesn't change the fact that a solo rescue operation into hostile territory is suicide. The Syrians' compound is fortified, likely 8 to 12 guards. Lieutenant Archer has been captive for 72 hours, which means he's injured, dehydrated, possibly unable to move under his own power. Even if you successfully infiltrate the extraction, in Desert Storm you walked 40 miles through enemy territory to extract a downed F-16 pilot. Kira's voice cut through his objections like a laser through smoke. Alone, no support, no backup, no authorization from command. I read your Silver Star citation, Colonel. You infiltrated an Iraqi motorized infantry unit's patrol base, eliminated 4 guards silently, carried the pilot 18 miles to the extraction point, then walked the remaining 22 miles when the helicopter was forced to abort due to ground fire. Thornton's jaw tightened. That citation was supposed to be classified. The details weren't public record, which meant Dalton had gone digging, had called in favors, had done her homework, just like a good scout sniper should. That was different. How? Kira took one step closer, and Thornton saw something in her eyes that made him uncomfortable. Not anger, not resentment, just a question that demanded an honest answer. How was it different, Colonel? Because you're a man and I'm a woman? The silence in the TOC was absolute. Every SEAL was watching this exchange with the intensity of men witnessing something that would become legend or disaster, possibly both. Commander Blackwell had his hand on his sidearm, though Thornton couldn't tell if that was habit or genuine concern that this situation was about to spiral out of control. Thornton looked at Chief Kira Dalton and saw something he'd spent 4 decades trying not to see. He saw a Marine who'd earned the right to be here, who'd walked through the same fire he'd walked through, who'd proven herself not despite being a woman, but simply by being an exceptional operator. And he saw his own prejudice reflected back at him in a way that made him deeply ashamed. But shame didn't change tactical reality. The reality, Chief, is that solo operations into fortified enemy positions have a failure rate exceeding 90%. Your odds of successfully extracting Lieutenant Archer are minimal. Your odds of dying in the attempt are nearly certain. I respect your courage, but courage without... Lieutenant Archer saved my life 2 years ago in Helmand Province. Kira's voice didn't rise, but the emotion underneath it made everyone in the room lean forward. We were running a joint operation, SEAL team and Marine Scout Sniper Overwatch. His team was pinned down by a Taliban ambush in a canyon. 8 fighters, fortified position, 800 yards from my hide site. The SEAL lieutenant coordinating the operation told me not to take the shot because the wind made accuracy impossible. She paused and Thornton saw her hands clench briefly at her sides before relaxing. Muscle memory of holding a rifle. The eternal stillness of a sniper waiting for the perfect moment. I took it anyway. 8 shots, 8 kills, 90 seconds. Lieutenant Archer's team walked out of that canyon alive because I didn't wait for permission. Afterward, he found me cleaning my rifle. He said that was the most impressive shooting he'd seen in 10 years. He asked who trained me, and I told him, "You, Colonel Victor Thornton," though I mentioned you'd probably say I was still just lucky with the wind. Thornton felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart, something harder. The armor he'd built around his certainty that he knew how the world worked, that he understood what people were capable of based on their demographics rather than their determination. Lieutenant Archer told me that day that I'd saved 6 lives, and that he owed me one. Kira's green eyes locked onto Thornton's with an intensity that made him want to look away, but wouldn't let him. He told me to stay alive so he could pay me back someday. Well, Colonel, today is someday, and I'm going to collect that debt whether you give me permission or not. The only question is whether you're going to stand in my way or help me do what you already know is the right thing. Commander Blackwell finally spoke, his voice careful. Chief Dalton, I understand your connection to Lieutenant Archer, But unauthorized operations aren't unprecedented. Kira turned to face him, and Blackwell took an involuntary step back from the force of her conviction. Colonel Thornton conducted one. In fact, based on my research, approximately 30% of successful hostage rescues in special operations history involved operators who violated orders to execute missions command deemed too risky. The difference between a court-martial and a medal often comes down to whether you succeed. And if you fail, Thornton's voice was quiet. If you die out there, Chief, what then? Do we write 2 eulogies instead of 1? Kira turned back to him, and for the first time since entering the room, he saw a flicker of something other than absolute certainty in her expression. Not doubt, something more profound. The look of someone who'd already made peace with death and found it acceptable. My father was a Marine Scout sniper, Colonel. He died in a training accident when I was 16. His last words to me were, "Never leave your people behind. Ever." I became a sniper to honor him, to prove that his legacy mattered, to prove that women could do this job at the highest level, and to prove that the code, our code, the one that says we bring everyone home, actually means something. She straightened to attention, her eyes locked on his. So yes, sir, if I fail, you'll write 2 eulogies, but you'll write them knowing that at least someone tried, that at least one person believed Lieutenant Brennan Archer was worth the risk, that at least one Marine lived up to the code instead of hiding behind regulations and acceptable loss ratios. Can you say the same, Colonel? The question hung in the air like smoke from a burning building. Thornton felt 40 years of certainty crumbling around him. He'd built his career on following orders, on respecting the chain of command, on believing that discipline and structure were what separated professional soldiers from chaos. But he'd also built his reputation on one unauthorized mission in the Iraqi desert, carrying a wounded pilot through enemy territory because leaving him behind was unacceptable. When had he become the man who wrote eulogies instead of the man who walked through fire? Follow me, Chief. Thornton walked out of the TOC without waiting to see if she obeyed. He heard her boots behind him, maintaining the proper 3-pace distance for a junior officer following a senior commander. He led her across the compound to the firing range on the eastern perimeter, where the pre-dawn darkness still held absolute dominion. The temperature had dropped to maybe 90 degrees, almost comfortable by Iraqi standards. He stopped at the 1,000-yard line, where a human silhouette target stood barely visible in the darkness. The wind had picked up, gusting from the northwest at 15 to 20 miles per hour. Perfect conditions for failure. You want my blessing, Chief? Thornton's voice was hard. Then prove you can handle what's coming. Prove that 72 hours from now, when you're exhausted and dehydrated and your hands are shaking from carrying a wounded man through hostile territory, you can still make the shot that matters. He gestured toward the rifle rack where an M40A6 stood waiting, the latest evolution of the weapon that had defined Marine Scout sniper capability for generations. 1,000 yards, 20-mile-per-hour crosswind, darkness, make the shot. Kira looked at him, and he saw understanding dawn in her eyes. This wasn't about the shot, this was about him, about whether he could admit he'd been wrong, about whether he could let go of 40 years of prejudice and see what was actually standing in front of him. Sir, I've been awake for 36 hours. I drove 40 miles through hostile territory to get here. My hands are shaking from exhaustion, and I can barely see straight. Lieutenant Archer has been captive for 72 hours, Chief. You think he's well rested? You think he's sharp? You think he's going to be able to help you fight your way out of that compound? Thornton's voice was brutal because the truth was brutal. This is mercy compared to what's waiting for you out there. Kira walked to the rifle rack, her movements economical and precise despite obvious exhaustion. She picked up the M40A6, checked the chamber out of habit, then settled into a prone position behind the weapon. Thornton watched her body language, looking for the signs of fatigue that would betray uncertainty. But her positioning was textbook perfect. Left leg cocked at 90 degrees for stability, right leg straight, elbows positioned to create a stable platform, head positioned for proper eye relief through the scope. She settled behind the rifle and began the ancient ritual of marrying human intention to mechanical precision. Range estimation, wind calculation, elevation adjustment, windage compensation. The mathematics of death delivered from a distance. Her first shot broke the silence like thunder. Thornton didn't need binoculars to know it had missed. The impact splash on the berm, 3 inches left of the target, told him everything. She'd overcompensated for the wind, or underestimated the distance, or failed to account for the slight upward angle of the range. See? His voice was harsher than he intended, driven by something that felt like vindication, but tasted like shame. You're not ready. Your body's breaking down. Your judgment's compromised. Go back to your unit, Chief. Let the professionals— With respect, sir. Kira's voice cut through his words like a blade through silk. Give me one more. Something in her tone made Thornton stop. Not pleading, not desperation, just the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly what had gone wrong and exactly how to fix it. The mark of a true professional. She made a tiny adjustment to the windage knob. 1 click, maybe 2. Then she settled back behind the rifle, and Thornton saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her breathing had slowed to the deep, measured rhythm of someone dropping into the zone where thought and action became one. She was compensating for her exhaustion, not by fighting it, but by accepting it, accounting for it, making it part of the equation instead of pretending it didn't exist. The second shot sounded identical to the first, but the result was completely different. Even in the darkness, Thornton saw the target rock backward on its stand from the impact. Center mass, perfect. Kira stood, safed the rifle, and turned to face him. Her eyes held no triumph, no satisfaction, just a question. Am I ready now, sir? Thornton looked at this woman who just made a shot he couldn't reliably make on his best day under perfect conditions, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. Not because she'd proven she was good enough, because she'd proven she was better. Better than him, better than most of the men he'd trained, better than he'd ever wanted to admit a woman could be. I was wrong about you, Chief. The words came hard, like pulling shrapnel from old wounds. In 2004, when I said you got lucky, and tonight when I doubted you could do this. He walked to his office at the edge of the range and returned with a topographical map marked with routes that weren't in any official database. He spread it across the shooting table, his fingers tracing paths through terrain that most intelligence analysts marked as impassable. This is the route I'd take. If I were 40 years younger, and stupid enough to attempt something this suicidal. His finger traced a path through a ravine system that bypassed 3 known insurgent checkpoints. The canyon here provides concealment, but also channels you into potential ambush points. You'll need to move at night, rest during the day. Water discipline is critical. You're looking at 127 miles through hostile territory. Kira studied the map with the intensity of someone committing every detail to memory. Her fingers traced the route, and Thornton saw her mentally calculating distances, estimating travel times, identifying potential hazards. This bypasses the checkpoints using the ravine system, she said quietly. Adds maybe 20 miles to the direct route, but cuts the probability of contact by 60%. Smart. It's how I survived Desert Storm, Chief. Thornton felt something loosen in his chest. Not quite forgiveness, maybe understanding. The direct route gets you killed. The smart route gets you home. She looked up at him, and he saw a glimmer of emotion break through her professional exterior. Thank you, Colonel. Don't thank me. His voice was rough. Just bring Lieutenant Archer home, and prove an old man wrong twice. I'll do my best, sir. Your best is better than most people's perfect, Chief. I should have told you that in 2004. I'm telling you now. You're one of the finest Marines I've ever had the privilege to train. Now go be the finest Marine I've ever had the privilege to watch work." Kira saluted him with parade ground precision, and he returned it with equal formality. Then she was gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness like a ghost. Thornton stood alone on the firing range, listening to the wind whistle across the empty desert, and realized he just participated in something that would either become legend or his final professional failure. He walked back to the TOC 90 minutes later to find Commander Blackwell coordinating with the intelligence section, trying to maintain operational awareness of a mission that officially didn't exist. Garrett Sutton had closed his laptop, the Eulogy unfinished. The other SEALs stood clustered around the tactical display, watching a single thermal signature moving south through terrain marked as hostile. "She's really doing it," Blackwell said quietly. "Alone. Through the corridor." The corridor was what they called the 40-mile stretch between Forward Operating Base Whiskey and the first confirmed insurgent stronghold. It was a known terrorist supply route, monitored by drones but too dangerous for regular patrols. Intelligence estimated at least 400 enemy fighters used it regularly. One wrong move, one moment of bad luck, and Chief Kira Dalton would simply disappear. "She's not alone," Thornton said, settling into a chair at the command console. "She's got us watching, and she's got a map that's kept more than one Marine alive when the odds said they should be dead. Colonel, if she doesn't make it back, then we write 2 eulogies instead of 1. Thornton's voice was flat. "But we write them knowing someone tried. That someone believed bringing Lieutenant Archer home was worth the risk. And maybe that's the most important thing we can do. Believe that our people are worth walking through hell for." He settled in to watch the thermal display, knowing sleep was impossible now. He just sent a 28-year-old Marine into harm's way based on nothing more than her word that she could do the impossible. If she died out there, her blood would be on his hands. But if he'd stopped her, if he'd let his prejudice and his fear dictate his actions, then Lieutenant Brennan Archer's blood would be on his hands instead. Some choices weren't about right and wrong. Some choices were about which ghosts you could live with. On the thermal display, Chief Kira Dalton's signature moved deeper into hostile territory. One step at a time, 1 mile at a time. Walking into hell with nothing but skill, determination, and a promise to bring a teammate home. Thornton watched and prayed and tried not to calculate the odds, because the odds said this was impossible, and he just bet everything on a woman who specialized in making the impossible look easy. The drainage culvert measured exactly 18 inches in diameter. Kira knew this because she'd spent 4 hours studying the compound through her thermal scope, measuring every detail, calculating every angle. 18 inches meant she'd have to remove her plate carrier, leave behind the extra magazines, strip down to the absolute minimum gear necessary for survival. It meant crawling 40 meters through absolute darkness in a space barely wide enough for her shoulders, trusting that the architectural drawings in the intelligence database were accurate and that the culvert hadn't collapsed somewhere in the middle. It meant accepting that if she encountered resistance inside that tunnel, there would be no room to fight, no space to maneuver, nowhere to go but forward or back. A death trap in the most literal sense. She checked her watch. 02:15 hours. The guard rotation had just completed. The next patrol wouldn't circle the north wall for another 30 minutes. Optimal window. She'd rehearsed this approach 50 times in her mind during the 4-hour observation period, visualizing each movement, identifying each potential failure point, planning contingencies for contingencies. Her body wanted to quit. 72 hours of continuous movement through hostile territory had stripped away everything except core function. Her feet were masses of blisters that had burst and reformed and burst again. Her shoulders ached from carrying 70 pounds of gear across terrain that varied from soft sand to knife-sharp rock. The gunshot wound she'd taken during the vehicle chase had stopped bleeding hours ago, but infection was setting in despite the antibiotics she'd forced down with the last of her water. Fever made the world shimmer at the edges, made distances hard to judge, made her wonder occasionally if any of this was real or just an exhaustion-induced hallucination. But her hands were steady, her mind was clear, and Lieutenant Brennan Archer was inside that compound, waiting for someone crazy enough or committed enough to come get him. Kira low-crawled to the culvert entrance, her body pressed flat against the sand, using the darkness and the slight depression in the terrain to mask her approach from the guard towers. 40 meters, then 30, then 20, each movement calculated to minimize her thermal signature, to present the smallest possible target to the automated surveillance systems that covered the compound's perimeter. The culvert entrance was partially blocked by debris, sand, rocks, and what looked like the remnants of a destroyed vehicle. She'd have to dig through by hand, silently, without creating the kind of disturbance that would draw attention from the guards 40 meters away. She pulled out her combat knife and began the painstaking process of excavating the entrance, one handful of sand at a time, working with the methodical patience of someone who understood that speed was the enemy of stealth. 15 minutes to clear enough space to squeeze through. 15 minutes of agonizing vulnerability, knowing that if a guard decided to walk the perimeter early, if a thermal drone happened to pass overhead, if she triggered any of a dozen possible sensors, the mission would end before it began. But the universe granted her the mercy of inattention, and she pulled herself into the culvert with 5 minutes to spare before the next patrol. The darkness inside was absolute, total, the kind of darkness that made you question whether your eyes were open or closed. She switched on her night vision goggles, and the world transformed into shades of green. The culvert stretched ahead, narrowing slightly at points, occasionally blocked by debris she'd have to navigate around or through. 40 meters, maybe 500 seconds of crawling if everything went perfectly. Triple that if she encountered obstacles. She began to move. The culvert was never meant for human passage. It was designed to channel runoff during the rare desert storms, to prevent flooding in the compound's basement levels. The concrete was rough, embedded with small rocks that scraped against her uniform and tore at her skin. The smell was overwhelming: stagnant water, decomposition, and something chemical that burned her throat and made her eyes water even behind the goggles. She focused on her breathing, keeping it shallow and controlled, ignoring the claustrophobia that tried to claw its way up from her hindbrain. 10 meters, 20, 30. At meter 25, she encountered the collapse. A section of the culvert ceiling had given way, creating a pile of rubble that blocked 3/4 of the passage. She could see a gap at the top, maybe 12 inches of clearance, but getting through would require excavating with her bare hands while lying on her stomach in a space that didn't allow her to lift her head more than 6 inches. Kira checked her watch, already 3 minutes behind schedule. The patrol would be at the north wall in 12 minutes. If she wasn't through this collapse and into the basement corridor by then, she'd be trapped in this culvert with no room to maneuver and no escape route. She began to dig. Sand and concrete filled the space under her chin, forced its way into her mouth and nose, despite her attempts to breathe through clenched teeth. Her fingernails tore. Blood made her hands slick. The fever made her movements clumsy, imprecise. She wanted to stop, wanted to rest, wanted to close her eyes for just a moment. But stopping meant dying, and dying meant Lieutenant Archer stayed in that cell, waiting for rescue that would never come. So she dug. 15 minutes later, covered in filth and blood and barely conscious, she pulled herself through the gap and into the basement corridor beyond. The culvert had deposited her in a maintenance access tunnel, dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in shades of red. She stripped off the night vision goggles and let her eyes adjust. 3 doors ahead. The intelligence package had identified them as storage, guard quarters, and prisoner holding. The question was, which door led to which room? because the architectural drawings were from 2003 and renovations since then weren't documented. She pressed her ear against the first door. Silence. The second door produced the sound of snoring. Multiple people. Guard quarters, which meant the third door was either storage or the prisoner's cell. 50-50 chance. Get it wrong and she'd waste time. Get it wrong badly and she'd stumble into a room full of weapons or explosives that would alert the entire compound. Kira pulled out her tactical lockpick set and went to work on the third door. 45 seconds of careful manipulation while her hands shook from exhaustion and fever. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. She eased the door open 6 inches, her suppressed Sig Sauer P226 raised and ready. The smell hit her first: blood, sweat, urine, and the particular stench of infection. A man sat chained to the wall in the corner, his head hanging forward, his breathing shallow and labored. Even in the dim emergency lighting, she could see the bruising on his face, the awkward way he held his ribs, the blood that had dried on his uniform. Lieutenant Brennan Archer looked like someone had spent 72 hours trying to break him and had almost succeeded. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps, her boots silent on the concrete. Up close, the damage was worse. His left eye was swollen shut. His lips were split in multiple places. His breathing had the wet, rattling quality that suggested internal bleeding or a collapsed lung. But when she touched his shoulder, his right eye opened immediately, and the hand that shot up to defend himself was still fast enough to surprise her. "Archer," she whispered, using his name directly this time. "It's Dalton. We're leaving." For a moment, he just stared at her, and she saw genuine confusion in his expression. Confusion mixed with something that might have been hope or might have been the hallucination of a dying man. His voice came out as a croak, barely audible. "Dalton? You're not real. Can't be real. You're 40 miles away." 127 miles, actually. She pulled out her bolt cutters and positioned them on the chain securing his hands. "And I'm extremely real. Can you walk?" "Can I run if I have to?" The words came out with more strength, and she saw awareness flooding back into his eyes. "There's a traitor. Someone sold us out. The Syrians showed me American intelligence documents. Someone on our side." Later, the bolt cutters bit through the chain with a snap that echoed like a gunshot in the small room. "Right now we move." She helped him to his feet, noting the way he favored his left side, the careful way he breathed to avoid aggravating what were almost certainly broken ribs. She pulled a field dressing kit from her vest and went to work with quick, efficient movements. Pressure bandage on the worst of the lacerations. Quick clotting agent on the actively bleeding wounds. Ibuprofen and antibiotics forced down his throat with the last of her water. "I need you functional for the next 6 hours, Lieutenant. After that, you can collapse and I'll carry you. But right now, I need you moving and thinking. Can you do that?" He met her eyes, and she saw the SEAL training reasserting itself. The ability to compartmentalize pain, to function despite injuries that would leave most people curled up and screaming. He straightened as much as his ribs would allow and nodded. "Lead the way, Chief." She handed him the AK-47 she'd taken from a checkpoint guard 3 days ago, checked that her own weapons were ready, and moved to the door. 3 guards between them and the east wall. Maybe more depending on how quickly the alarm was raised. The element of surprise wouldn't last long once they started moving. The question was whether they could leverage those first few seconds into enough of an advantage to reach the perimeter before overwhelming force made escape impossible. She eased the door open and came face to face with a guard who decided to check on the prisoner 30 seconds ahead of schedule. The guard's eyes widened. His mouth opened to shout. Kira put 2 rounds through his forehead before his vocal cords could engage, the suppressed pistol making soft spitting sounds that were quieter than a cough. The guard dropped, and she was already moving, knowing that the element of surprise was burning away like morning mist. The corridor erupted into chaos. Two more guards came around the corner, drawn by some sixth sense or maybe just bad luck. Kira put the first one down with a double tap to the chest, but the second one got his weapon up and started firing. The AK-47's distinctive chatter filled the hallway with thunder. She felt rounds snap past her head, felt the supersonic crack of bullets that missed by inches. Behind her, Lieutenant Archer opened up with his own AK, firing controlled bursts that spoke of training overriding injury. The second guard went down. Then a third appeared from the guard quarters, and Kira realized they'd kicked a hornet's nest. The entire basement was waking up, and they were trapped in a narrow corridor with limited ammunition and no good options. She pulled a flashbang from her vest and threw it blind around the corner. The explosion came 3 seconds later, a concussive blast that rattled her teeth even from 30 feet away. She charged through the smoke in disorientation, moving on pure aggression now because hesitation meant death. A guard stumbled out of the smoke, temporarily blinded and deafened. She put 3 rounds into his center mass. Another guard raised his weapon. Lieutenant Archer's burst caught him across the chest, dropping him instantly. A third guard came from a doorway she hadn't cleared, and she realized her mistake a half second before he opened fire. The rounds missed her by fractions of an inch, close enough that she felt the heat. She pivoted, bringing her pistol around, but Lieutenant Archer was faster. His K-bar knife, pulled from the downed guard's belt, buried itself in the fighter's throat with the kind of precision that came from years of close-quarters combat training. The guard dropped, clutching at the blade, drowning in his own blood. 5 guards down, maybe 3 remaining in the compound. But the alarm was raised now. She could hear shouting from above, hear boots pounding on stairs, hear the distinctive rack of weapons being made ready. They had maybe 30 seconds before this basement turned into a kill box with them at the center. "East wall," she snapped. "Move now." They sprinted down the corridor, Kira leading because she knew the layout, and Lieutenant Archer following because his body was operating on borrowed time and battlefield drugs. The stairs led up to the main courtyard, 60 meters of open ground between them and the east wall, 12 feet of concrete topped with barbed wire, guards converging from 3 directions, spotlights sweeping the compound. The math was impossible, but impossible was just another word for not yet attempted. Kira pulled her second flashbang and threw it toward the main gate, creating a distraction. Then she pulled her last smoke grenade and threw it toward the east wall, creating concealment. 30 seconds of chaos, maybe 45 if they were lucky. They'd need every second. "Run," she said. "Don't stop, don't look back. Run." They ran. The courtyard exploded into noise. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like strobes at a nightclub. Concrete exploded around their feet as rounds impacted. She heard the supersonic crack of bullets, passing close enough to part her hair. But they kept running, kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and they'd come too far to die now. Lieutenant Archer reached the wall first and dropped to one knee, creating a platform with his hands, despite the agony it must have caused his broken ribs. Kira stepped into his grip and felt herself launched upward, her hands catching the top of the wall. The barbed wire tore at her palms. She ignored it, pulled herself up and over, then immediately turned and dropped the climbing rope she'd carried for this exact moment. "Climb!" she shouted down at him. "Now!" He climbed, slower than she would have liked, hampered by his injuries and the exhaustion that was dragging at both of them. But he climbed, and she pulled, her injured shoulder screaming protest that she ignored because failure wasn't an option. The Syrian appeared in the courtyard below, his face twisted with rage, raising an AK to cut them down. Kira drew her pistol with her free hand and fired blind. 3 shots. The first missed. The second hit the Syrian in the shoulder. The third hit somewhere in his center mass, enough to make him stagger, but not enough to put him down. Then Lieutenant Archer was over the wall, and they were dropping to the other side, landing hard in sand that gave way beneath them. Behind them, the compound erupted into full alert. Lights blazed, sirens wailed, and the distinctive sound of a vehicle starting told Kira that pursuit was already being organized. They had maybe 90 seconds before that vehicle reached the perimeter, maybe 2 minutes before the Syrian and his remaining fighters poured through the gate. The head start wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was all they had. "Keep moving," she gasped, already pulling Lieutenant Archer to his feet. "Vehicle pursuit incoming. We need distance." They ran into the open desert, and Kira heard the vehicle behind them, heard its engine roaring as it accelerated. She turned, dropped to one knee, and pulled her M40A6 off her back. The vehicle was 600 meters away, moving at 40 miles per hour, at night, with her hands shaking from exhaustion and blood loss, and an infected wound that was making her vision blur. The shot was impossible. She made it anyway. The .308 round caught the vehicle's radiator, dead center, punching through the thin metal and destroying the cooling system in an instant. She saw steam explode from under the hood, saw the vehicle swerve and slow as the engine overheated. Not a kill shot, but enough to reduce pursuit from a vehicle chase to a foot race. And in a foot race, she had the advantage of knowing the terrain and having a head start measured in precious seconds. "Move," she said again, and they moved. The desert became a nightmare of sand and rock and exhaustion that dragged at every step. Kira led the way, navigating by GPS and memory and the intimate knowledge of terrain she'd studied for 72 hours. Lieutenant Archer followed, his breathing growing more labored with each mile, his movements becoming mechanical as his body began to shut down. But he kept moving because stopping meant death, and neither of them had walked this far to die within sight of victory. Behind them, pursuit continued on foot. She could hear them, could track their progress by the occasional shout or the distinctive sound of equipment rattling against web gear. The Syrians' fighters were younger than her, fresher than her, probably better equipped and certainly more numerous. But they didn't have her motivation. They weren't carrying a promise made in blood and honor. They were just men following orders. And that made all the difference. The sun rose, and with it came heat that transformed the desert into a furnace. The temperature climbed past 110 degrees, past 115. The air became something physical, something that had to be pushed through rather than breathed. Kira's fever spiked, made worse by the heat and the dehydration, and the simple biological fact that her body was eating itself to find the energy to keep moving. She stumbled, caught herself, kept walking, stumbled again, caught herself again, kept walking. Lieutenant Archer's voice came from somewhere behind her, distant and distorted by exhaustion. "Why'd you come? Orders said stand down." She forced words through cracked lips. "You saved me, Helmand. I save you here. That's the code. That was different. That was my job. This is my job. Marines don't leave people behind." Silence for several steps, then his voice again, quieter now. "Thank you. Thank me when we're on the helicopter, Lieutenant, not before." They walked through the morning and into the afternoon. The pursuit fell back, either exhausted or convinced that two people on foot in the desert would die anyway, making active pursuit unnecessary. Kira checked her GPS. 60 miles to friendly lines. 60 miles carrying a man who weighed over 200 pounds, through terrain that varied from soft sand that swallowed her boots to rock formations that required careful navigation. 60 miles in heat that could kill even without hostile action. She thought about her father, wondered what he would say if he could see her now, wondered if he'd be proud or horrified or both. She thought about Colonel Thornton, watching from somewhere safe, probably calculating the odds of her survival and coming up with numbers that approached zero. She thought about all the reasons this was insane, impossible, suicide. Then she stopped thinking and just walked. The sun passed its zenith and began the long descent toward the western horizon. The heat remained brutal, but at least it wasn't getting worse. Kira forced herself to eat an MRE, gagging down food that tasted like cardboard and chemicals. She made Lieutenant Archer eat too, ignoring his protests because collapsing from hunger would kill them just as dead as enemy bullets. They walked through the afternoon and into the evening. Lieutenant Archer passed out twice. The first time she dragged him 10 meters before he regained consciousness. The second time she gave him the last of her water and waited 5 minutes for him to recover. There wouldn't be a third time. Next time he collapsed, she'd carry him until her body gave out or they reached friendly lines, whichever came first. The GPS showed 30 miles remaining when the minefield appeared. Kira stood at the edge of the marked danger zone and felt something close to despair. The intelligence database was clear: Soviet PMN-2 pressure mines, unknown density and distribution, no confirmed safe passage. An American convoy had been destroyed here 2 years ago, and the resulting investigation had marked the entire 3-square-kilometer area as impassable. Detour would add 8 hours to their journey. Lieutenant Archer wouldn't survive 8 more hours. His breathing had that wet, rattling quality that suggested his collapsed lung was filling with fluid. His skin was gray. His pulse was thready and irregular. 8 hours meant he died. Going through the minefield meant they both probably died. But probably wasn't certainly, and 8 hours of detour was definitely fatal. The encrypted radio on her vest crackled to life. Colonel Thornton's voice, rough with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. "Dalton, I'm looking at your GPS location. That's the Azir minefield. Soviet PMN-2 pressure mines. 5-kilogram trigger weight. Walking through that with your load is suicide." "I know what PMN-2s are, Colonel." "Then you know you can't cross it. The detour adds 8 hours, but it's survivable. The minefield isn't. Lieutenant Archer won't survive 8 hours. His lung is collapsing. He needs a surgical suite within the next 4 hours or he dies. So I'm going through." Silence on the radio. Then Thornton's voice again, quieter now. "What would you do, Chief, if you were me, if you were watching someone you'd trained walk into certain death?" Kira studied the minefield, looking for the faint disturbances in the sand that marked mine placements, looking for patterns in the chaos, looking for the thread of survival in the tapestry of death. "I'd go through," she said finally, "and I'd use my knife to probe every 6 inches, and I'd pray a lot. Then God be with you, Marine, because I can't help you with this one." She turned to Lieutenant Archer, who'd regained enough consciousness to understand what she was planning. His face was pale, his expression somewhere between awe and horror. "Dalton, you can't carry me through that. One wrong step." "I'm aware of the math, Lieutenant. Now shut up and let me work." She picked him up in a fireman's carry, feeling her injured shoulder protest, feeling her abdominal muscles threaten to tear, feeling every injury she'd accumulated over the past 72 hours scream for attention. She ignored all of it. Pain was temporary. Failure was permanent. The minefield stretched before her, 400 meters of sand that concealed death beneath every footstep. She pulled out her K-bar combat knife and began to probe. 6 inches forward. Check for resistance. No mine. Step forward. Repeat. 6 inches. Probe. Step. 6 inches. Probe. Step. Each step took 45 seconds. 400 meters. Roughly 440 steps. 19,800 seconds. 5.5 hours of perfect precision while carrying 200 pounds through a minefield where one mistake meant they both died in an explosion of fire and shrapnel. The math was impossible, but she'd built a career on making impossible look routine. She walked. The sun set and the temperature dropped and the desert transformed into a landscape of shadows and silver light. Kira's vision narrowed to the small circle illuminated by her tactical light. Probe. Step. Probe. Step. The rhythm became meditative, mechanical, the only reality that mattered in a universe that had contracted to the space between footfalls. At minute 25, her boot touched a pressure plate. She felt it the instant before her weight fully transferred. felt the slight give beneath the sand, the mechanical compression of the trigger mechanism. The pressure differential was minute. If she shifted backward without adding more weight, without allowing momentum to compress the trigger further, she might survive. She froze, completely, didn't breathe, didn't blink, became a statue carved from flesh that refused to accept the reality of imminent death. Lieutenant Archer, semi-conscious on her shoulders, felt her stop and understood immediately. "Don't move," he whispered. "Don't even breathe." Kira's mind raced through the physics. Weight distributed between both feet, but more on the forward foot where the mind was. If she could shift backward without increasing pressure, without allowing momentum to add even a fraction of additional force to that trigger plate, she might survive. She began to shift her weight backward, molecular precision, geological slowness, transferring force from front to back so gradually that the pressure on the mind decreased rather than increased. The universe contracted to that single point of contact between boot sole and detonator. Everything else ceased to exist. It took 90 seconds to complete the weight transfer and lift her boot clear. 90 seconds during which she didn't breathe, didn't think, didn't exist as anything except the intention to survive. When her boot finally lifted free, she heard Lieutenant Archer exhale behind her head, a sound that contained more emotion than any words could express. She waited 10 seconds for her hands to stop shaking. Then she continued forward. Probe, step, probe, step. 35 minutes after entering the minefield, she emerged on the far side. Both of them alive. Both of them intact. Both of them having survived something that should have killed them 10 times over. She collapsed immediately, unable to take another step. Lieutenant Archer rolled off her shoulders and lay in the sand beside her, both of them gasping like fish on dry land. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to their survival or death, marking the passage of time in a universe that cared nothing for the struggles of two humans in a desert that had swallowed armies. Kira forced herself to check the GPS. 10 miles to FOB Whiskey. 10 miles that might as well have been 1,000 given the state of her body. Her fever had climbed high enough that she was seeing double. Her shoulder wound had reopened during the minefield crossing, and blood soaked the left side of her uniform. Her legs shook with exhaustion that went beyond physical into something that threatened her ability to form coherent thoughts. But 10 miles, just 10 more miles. She pulled Lieutenant Archer to his feet, got him positioned across her shoulders, and began to walk. One step, then another, then another. The universe contracted again, this time to the simple binary of movement versus stillness. As long as she kept moving, they survived. The moment she stopped, they died. So she moved. The encrypted radio crackled. "Dalton, this is Thornton. I'm watching your GPS. You're 10 miles out. Base has been alerted. Medical is standing by. Just keep moving, Marine. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other." She wanted to respond but couldn't spare the breath, so she just walked. Thornton kept talking, his voice a lifeline in the darkness, talking about nothing and everything, filling the silence with words that kept her anchored to reality when exhaustion tried to drag her into unconsciousness. "I told Blackwell to have them write 2 eulogies," Thornton said. "One for Archer if you failed, one for you if you didn't come back. But you're coming back, Dalton. You're bringing him home. And when you get here, I'm going to personally recommend you for the Silver Star." She walked. "You know what I realized watching you out there? I spent my whole career teaching Marines that perfect technique beats physical strength, that determination beats size, that skill beats luck. But I had blind spots. I believed certain people couldn't do certain things because of my generation's prejudices." She walked. "You proved me wrong, Dalton. You proved that excellence has no gender, that the only thing that matters is the heart that refuses to quit and the skill to back up that determination. You're the finest Marine I ever trained, and I should have told you that in 2004. I'm telling you now. Keep moving. Keep bringing him home." The horizon began to glow. Dawn approaching. Kira crested a small rise and saw it. Forward operating base whiskey. Lights blazing in the pre-dawn darkness. A beacon of safety just miles away. Her legs gave out at mile 8. She crawled for 200 meters, dragging Lieutenant Archer behind her on an improvised travois made from her shredded ghillie suit. Her hands bled. Her knees bled. She left a trail of blood and desperation in the sand, but she kept moving because stopping meant failure, and failure wasn't acceptable. At mile 9, Lieutenant Archer regained enough consciousness to walk with support. Together, propping each other up, they covered the final mile. Two broken warriors held together by nothing except the promise that Marines bring their people home. Always, no matter the cost. The sun broke over the eastern horizon as Kira crested the final ridge. Below her, FOB Whiskey stood waiting. She could see figures moving at the perimeter, could see the gate standing open, could see medical personnel with stretchers, waiting. She took one more step, then another, then another. Behind her, the desert stretched endlessly, a testament to what two people could survive when the alternative was abandoning a promise written in blood and honor. Ahead of her, home waited. She walked toward it, carrying her teammate, carrying her mission complete, carrying proof that impossible was just another word for not yet attempted. And with each step, the shadow on the ridge grew larger, more solid, more real, until it resolved into the figure that would become legend in the teams. A Marine who'd walked through hell and brought someone home, just like she'd promised. The observation post sentry had been staring at the same stretch of empty desert for 6 hours straight when the shadow appeared on the ridge. At first, he thought it was heat shimmer, a trick of the rising sun playing games with exhausted eyes. Then he raised his binoculars and felt his world tilt sideways. A single figure moved across the ridgeline, backlit by the golden light of dawn. The silhouette was unmistakable, even at 2,000 meters. Someone carrying another person across their shoulders in a fireman's carry. The figure moved with the mechanical precision of someone who'd pushed past exhaustion into a place where the body operated on pure willpower and the mind had shut down everything except the most basic functions. Left foot, right foot, repeat. The sentry keyed his radio, his voice cracking despite years of training designed to keep emotion out of tactical communications. OP Alpha to TOC, I have movement on the ridge, 2 clicks out, single person carrying what appears to be another individual, requesting permission to engage. In the Tactical Operations Center, Commander James Blackwell looked up from the satellite display where he'd been tracking a thermal signature for the past 8 hours. The signature that had walked 127 miles through hostile territory. The signature that had disappeared into a fortified compound and emerged 30 minutes later with a second heat source. The signature that had crossed a minefield that killed an entire convoy 2 years ago. The signature that belonged to Chief Kira Dalton. Negative on engagement, Blackwell said, his voice tight. All stations hold fire. OP Alpha, give me a description. The sentry adjusted his binoculars, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Height approximately 5'6", female profile based on body structure. Wearing what looks like a ghillie suit, mostly destroyed. Carrying M40 variant rifle across back. And she's, Jesus Christ, sir, she's carrying a full-grown man across her shoulders. Colonel Victor Thornton was already moving toward the door. He'd been in the TOC for 72 hours straight, sleeping in 15-minute intervals, watching that thermal signature crawl across terrain that should have killed Kira Dalton 100 times over. He'd watched her infiltrate the compound, watched the firefight that erupted during extraction, watched her make an impossible shot to disable the pursuing vehicle, watched her carry Lieutenant Archer through a minefield that his own classified assessment had marked as impassable. And now she was here, 2,000 meters away, close enough that nothing short of divine intervention or catastrophic bad luck could stop her from completing a mission that would rewrite the understanding of what was humanly possible. Thornton hit the compound moving faster than seemed possible for a man his age. Behind him, the entire base was mobilizing. SEALs pouring out of barracks. Medical personnel scrambling toward the gate with stretchers and emergency equipment. Officers and enlisted alike converging on the perimeter to witness something that would become legend. Garrett Sutton reached the gate first, his face streaked with tears he didn't bother to hide. He'd been writing a eulogy for his best friend 72 hours ago. Now he was watching that friend come home, carried by a Marine who'd done what an entire quick reaction force couldn't accomplish. He grabbed the gate controls and manually overrode the automated system, forcing the massive steel barriers to swing open faster than their motors intended. The medics formed up just inside the perimeter, their equipment ready, their faces showing the professional calm that came from years of emergency medicine. But their eyes told a different story. They'd been briefed on what Chief Dalton had endured over the past 72 hours. The distance covered, the combat engaged, the minefield crossed, the simple biological impossibility of what she'd accomplished. And now they were about to see the result. Thornton cleared the gate and stopped, his chest heaving from exertion, his eyes locked on the figure descending the ridge. From this distance, he could see details that the thermal imaging hadn't revealed. The way Kira's legs shook with each step, threatening to collapse but somehow finding the strength to continue. The blood that soaked her left shoulder and ran down her arm to drip from her fingertips. The destroyed remains of her uniform, torn and shredded by 72 hours of continuous movement through hostile terrain. The ghillie suit that had been a masterwork of camouflage and now hung in tatters, trailing pieces of desert vegetation like some kind of nightmare scarecrow. And across her shoulders, Lieutenant Brennan Archer, barely conscious, his face swollen and bruised almost beyond recognition, his uniform stained with blood both fresh and dried. His breathing audible even at 50 meters, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of serious internal injuries. But alive. Against all odds, against all probability, against everything that mathematics and military doctrine said was possible, Lieutenant Brennan Archer was alive. Kira reached the perimeter and stopped. For a moment, Thornton thought she'd finally collapsed, that her body had simply given out within sight of safety. But then she straightened as much as her injuries allowed, and he realized she was trying to come to attention, trying to render proper military courtesy even though she could barely stand. "Colonel Thornton!" Her voice was a rasp, barely audible, destroyed by dehydration and 72 hours of breathing desert air. "Sir," she tried to salute. Her arm made it halfway up before muscle failure stopped the motion. Thornton closed the distance between them in 3 strides and caught her arm before it could fall. "Chief Dalton." His voice cracked despite 4 decades of maintaining perfect emotional control. "You can put him down now." Kira looked at him with eyes that seemed to have trouble focusing. Fever and exhaustion had pushed her past the point where normal sensory input made sense. She blinked slowly, processing his words as if they were in a foreign language she'd once studied but couldn't quite remember. "Can't, sir. Promised I'd bring him to the gate, not the ridge. Have to finish." "This is the gate, Marine." Thornton's voice was gentle in a way that none of his students had ever heard. "You made it. Mission complete. You can rest now." Understanding dawned slowly in her fever-bright eyes. She looked past him at the open gate, at the medics waiting with stretchers, at the assembled personnel who'd gathered to witness her return. Then she looked down at Lieutenant Archer, checking his condition one final time with the automatic precision of someone who'd been responsible for another person's life for the past 72 hours. Only then did she begin the careful process of lowering him to the ground. Even in the final moments, even with her body shutting down and her mind operating on nothing but trained responses, she moved with controlled precision. She bent at the knees, using proper lifting technique in reverse, laying Lieutenant Archer on the stretcher the medics had positioned beside her, with the kind of care usually reserved for handling live explosives. She adjusted his position so that his damaged ribs weren't compressed, checked his airway was clear, felt for his pulse one last time. The medics swarmed Lieutenant Archer immediately, their movements efficient and professional. IV lines, oxygen mask, rapid assessment of injuries. Within seconds, they had him on the stretcher and were moving toward the medical tent at a controlled run. Kira stood watching them go, swaying on her feet like a tree in a windstorm. Blood ran down her arm and dripped from her fingers to stain the sand. Her legs shook so badly that Thornton could see the tremors from 5 feet away. But she remained upright through pure force of will, refusing to collapse until she knew Lieutenant Archer was in competent hands. A second medical team approached her with another stretcher. The lead medic, a Navy corpsman with 20 years of experience, took one look at her condition and reached for her arm. "Chief, we need to get you to the medical tent. You're bleeding out and—" "Him first." Kira's voice was barely audible, but the command in it was absolute. "Lieutenant Archer gets treated first. That's an order." The corpsman looked at Thornton, clearly hoping for support in overruling a patient who was obviously in no condition to be giving orders. But Thornton understood what was happening. Kira had carried Lieutenant Archer for over 60 miles, had made him her sole responsibility for 3 days, had prioritized his survival over her own at every decision point. She couldn't surrender that responsibility until she was certain he was being cared for, until she knew absolutely that her mission was complete. "Follow her order," Thornton said quietly. "Lieutenant Archer gets priority. Chief Dalton can wait 5 more minutes." The corpsman looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Thornton's expression stopped him. He nodded and moved to join the team working on Lieutenant Archer. Thornton watched Kira's eyes track the medics as they disappeared into the medical tent, watched her count the seconds, watched her wait until she was certain that Lieutenant Archer was receiving proper care. Only then did her knees buckle. Thornton caught her, lowering her carefully to the sand, and for a moment he saw something he'd never seen before in 4 decades of military service. She was crying, silent tears that cut tracks through the dust and blood on her face. Not from pain, though he knew she must be in agony. Not from relief, though she'd earned that emotion 10 times over. But from something deeper, the release of a responsibility she'd carried for 72 hours. The knowledge that her promise had been kept. That Lieutenant Brennan Archer was home and safe and alive because she'd been willing to walk through hell to bring him back. "You did it," Thornton said softly, supporting her head as the medics finally reached them. "You proved me wrong twice, Chief, and I've never been more honored to be wrong in my life." Kira's eyes found his, and for a moment, clarity returned. "Mission complete, sir?" "Mission complete, Marine. Now let these people do their job." She nodded once, then let unconsciousness take her. The medics moved with practiced efficiency, starting IVs, assessing injuries, preparing her for transport. Thornton stood and watched them work, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline that was only now beginning to fade. Commander Blackwell appeared at his shoulder, his face showing an emotion Thornton had rarely seen in special operations officers. "Aw, she actually did it," Blackwell said quietly. 127 miles, through hostile territory, solo infiltration of a fortified compound, combat extraction, vehicle pursuit, a minefield, and she carried him the last 60 miles. "She did." Thornton's voice was rough. "And every officer in this compound who doubted her, myself included, owes her an apology and a debt we can never fully repay." Garrett Sutton pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of joy and disbelief. Is he going to make it?" "The corpsman says his vitals are stabilizing. Collapsed lung, broken ribs, severe dehydration, possible internal bleeding. But he's alive, and that means he has a chance." Thornton turned to look at the younger SEAL. "Your friend is alive because a Marine refused to accept that some missions are impossible. Remember that, son. Remember it when you're tempted to write someone off based on what you think they can or can't do. The next 48 hours blurred together in a haze of medical procedures, intelligence debriefs, and the careful political maneuvering required when a junior enlisted Marine conducted an unauthorized operation that saved a SEAL officer's life. Commander Blackwell spent hours on encrypted communications with higher headquarters, simultaneously defending Kira's actions and explaining why he hadn't prevented them in the first place. The facts, at least, were indisputable. Lieutenant Brennan Archer had been held captive for 72 hours in a compound that conventional forces couldn't assault without risking his execution. Chief Kira Dalton had conducted a solo rescue operation that violated approximately 15 different regulations and succeeded against odds that multiple analysts calculated at less than 1%. She'd killed 5 enemy combatants, extracted a wounded friendly, and evaded pursuit across 127 miles of hostile territory. The insurgent leader known as the Syrian had survived Kira's shoulder wound. In the immediate aftermath of the rescue, he'd made a critical mistake by contacting his handler to report the failed hostage situation. That communication, intercepted by signals intelligence, had revealed the traitor inside American ranks. Staff Sergeant Michael Reeves, a communications analyst at the brigade headquarters, had been selling intelligence to insurgent groups for 18 months. Patrol routes, mission timings, equipment manifests. He'd been paid $50,000 for information that led directly to Lieutenant Archer's capture. Within 6 hours of the communications intercept, Reeves was in military police custody, and within 24 hours, he'd confessed to everything. The Syrian himself escaped across the border into Syria within hours of the failed operation. Coalition intelligence tracked him for 6 months before losing his signature in the chaos of the Syrian civil war. He would resurface briefly 2 years later in a different theater, but by then, the networks he'd built had collapsed. His American intelligence source was gone. His compound was destroyed. His reputation as an untouchable insurgent leader had been shattered by a single Marine who'd walked through his defenses like they didn't exist. The betrayal hit the special operations community hard. These were men who'd built their entire professional lives on trust, on the absolute certainty that the person next to you would die before betraying you. Learning that someone had sold out a teammate for money was a wound that went deeper than any physical injury. But at least it was resolved. At least the traitor had been caught. And at least Lieutenant Archer would have the satisfaction of knowing that justice was being served. Kira remained unconscious for the first 18 hours, her body finally surrendering to injuries and exhaustion that should have killed her days ago. The medical team worked around the clock, treating her gunshot wound, fighting the infection that had spread through her shoulder, rehydrating a body that had been running on fumes for the better part of a week. They cataloged her injuries with a kind of clinical awe. Gunshot wound to the left shoulder, second-degree burns on her hands from the minefield knife work, severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, muscle tears in both legs, blisters that had burst and reformed multiple times, minor shrapnel wounds from the compound firefight, and a fever that had peaked at 103 degrees, high enough to cause permanent damage if it hadn't been brought down quickly. The fact that she'd completed her mission in this condition wasn't just impressive, it bordered on medically impossible. Thornton spent most of those first 48 hours in the medical tent, dividing his time between Kira's bedside and Lieutenant Archer's. He told himself he was there to provide command presence, to ensure the medical staff had everything they needed. But the truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. He needed to see them both survive, needed to know that his decision to let Kira attempt this mission hadn't resulted in tragedy. On the second day, Kira finally regained consciousness. Thornton was sitting beside her bed when her eyes opened, cataloging her surroundings with the automatic threat assessment of someone who'd spent too long in hostile territory. She saw the medical equipment first, then the IV lines in her arms, then finally Thornton's face. "Colonel." Her voice was still rough, but stronger than it had been at the gate. "Sir." Chief Dalton. Thornton felt relief wash over him so powerfully that he had to blink away moisture from his eyes. Welcome back. She processed that for a moment, then asked the only question that mattered. Lieutenant Archer? Stable. The surgeons repaired his collapsed lung. He has 3 broken ribs, severe dehydration, and assorted other injuries, but he's going to make a full recovery. He's been asking about you every time he regains consciousness. Something in her expression relaxed, the tension she'd been carrying for 72 hours finally releasing. Good. That's good. Thornton leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped in front of him. For a long moment, he didn't speak, just looked at this woman who'd proven him wrong in the most profound way possible. Finally, he found the words he'd been trying to formulate for 2 days. I was wrong about you, Chief. In 2004, when I told you that you'd gotten lucky with the wind, and 72 hours ago when I doubted that you could complete this mission, I was wrong in a way that shames me as an officer and as a man. Kira started to speak, but he held up one hand. Let me finish. I spent 40 years training Marines, over 1,000 students. I taught them that perfect technique beats physical strength, that determination beats size, that skill beats luck. But I had blind spots. I genuinely believed that women couldn't handle the physical and mental demands of scout sniper operations, that they lacked something essential that couldn't be trained or learned. He paused, feeling the weight of those 4 decades of prejudice. You didn't just prove me wrong, Chief. You did something I couldn't do, something I wouldn't have attempted even in my prime. You walked 127 miles through enemy territory, conducted a solo assault on a fortified position, extracted a wounded teammate under fire, and carried him 60 miles through terrain that included a minefield. You're not just a good Marine, you're the finest operator I've ever had the privilege to train. And I'm sorry it took something this extreme for me to admit it. Kira looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, just a quiet understanding that made his shame cut deeper. You gave me the map, Colonel, the route through the ravine system. You supported me when you could have stopped me. You were on the radio during the minefield crossing, keeping me anchored when exhaustion tried to drag me under. Her voice was soft but certain. Belief can come later. Trust has to come first. You trusted me when it mattered most, and that's what I'll remember. Thornton felt his throat tighten. This woman who had every right to be bitter about the prejudice she'd faced, about the obstacles placed in her path by men like him, was offering him grace he didn't deserve, offering understanding when he'd earned judgment. You're a better person than I deserve, Chief, but I want you to know something. I'm going to spend whatever time I have left making sure that no other woman has to walk the path you walked, that no other Marine has to prove themselves beyond any reasonable standard just to be accepted as an equal. That would mean a lot, sir. The door to the medical tent opened, and Garrett Sutton entered, his face showing the kind of emotional exhaustion that came from relief after sustained terror. Behind him came 3 more SEALs, all of them dressed in their combat uniforms, all of them moving with the formal precision of men on an important mission. Chief Dalton, Garrett said, coming to attention beside her bed. Permission to approach? Kira looked confused but nodded. The 4 SEALs formed a line beside her bed, and Garrett pulled something from his pocket. In his palm sat a SEAL Trident pin, the distinctive insignia that marked membership in one of the most exclusive brotherhoods in the military. Chief, you brought our brother home from hell itself. You walked through territory that killed 3 of our teammates last year. You conducted an operation that we couldn't authorize and wouldn't have attempted. And you succeeded where conventional forces failed. His voice was thick with emotion. That makes you family, and we'd be honored if you'd accept this. He held out the Trident pin. Kira stared at it, understanding the significance but clearly uncertain whether she could accept something so meaningful from a community she'd never formally been part of. I'm not a SEAL, she said quietly. No, Garrett agreed, but you earned this more than most SEALs ever will. You exemplified everything we claim to be about: excellence, courage, commitment, and the absolute refusal to leave a teammate behind, regardless of the cost. He placed the trident in her hand and closed her fingers around it gently. Your family now, Chief. Always will be. The other SEALs came to attention and saluted her in unison. It was an honor typically reserved for senior officers or warriors who'd performed acts of extraordinary heroism. And as Thornton watched these hardened special operations soldiers render that salute to a woman they'd barely known 72 hours ago, he felt something shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. It wasn't about gender. It wasn't about physical size or strength. It was about the heart that refused to quit and the skill to back up that determination. And by that standard, Chief Kira Dalton was a warrior in the truest sense of the word. On the third day, Kira was finally cleared to walk with assistance. Against medical advice and over the protests of the nursing staff, she made her way across the compound to where Lieutenant Archer was recovering. Thornton walked beside her, ostensibly for support, but really because he wanted to witness this moment. Archer was sitting up in bed when they entered, his chest wrapped in bandages that covered his repaired lung and broken ribs. His face was still swollen and bruised, but his eyes were clear and alert. When he saw Kira, something in his expression shifted. Joy mixed with disbelief, mixed with a gratitude so profound that words seemed inadequate to express it. Dalton, his voice was rough but strong. They told me what you did, that you walked 127 miles, alone, for me. Kira lowered herself carefully into the chair beside his bed, her movements showing the pain she was still carrying. For you, for Helmand, for the code that says we bring everyone home. Helmand was my job. This was, he struggled to find words. This was beyond anything anyone should ask or expect. It was my job too, Lieutenant. Same code, same obligation. Marines don't leave people behind, ever. They sat in silence for a moment, two warriors who'd shared an experience that bound them together more tightly than any words could express. Finally, Archer reached for his phone on the bedside table, his movements careful to avoid aggravating his injuries. I need to show you something. He pulled up a photo and turned the screen toward her. This is Emma, my daughter, born 5 days before I was captured. I didn't know if I'd ever... His voice broke. Kira looked at the photo of a newborn with the kind of wonder that came from understanding how close this child had come to growing up without a father. She's beautiful, Brennan. My wife already decided on her full name. He managed a smile despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Emma Kira Archer, middle name after you, if that's okay. Kira's professional composure finally cracked. Tears ran down her face as the full weight of what she'd accomplished hit her. Not the military significance, not the tactical brilliance, but the simple human fact that a child would grow up knowing her father because one Marine had refused to accept that some missions were impossible. I'm honored, she whispered. I'm so honored. No, Archer's voice was firm, despite the tears streaming down his own face. The honor is mine, and Emma's, and everyone who'll grow up hearing this story. You showed us what's possible when courage meets skill, meets absolute determination. You rewrote what we thought we knew about human capability. Thornton stood in the doorway, watching this exchange, and felt the last piece of his old worldview crumble. He'd spent 40 years believing that warriors were defined by their physical attributes, by their conformity to traditional standards. But he'd been wrong. Warriors were defined by their willingness to walk through fire for their teammates, by their refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain, by the promises they kept, even when keeping those promises required the impossible. And by that standard, Chief Kira Dalton was a warrior in a way that humbled everyone who witnessed what she'd done. The next few months passed in a blur of debriefs, medical treatment, and the slow process of healing both physical and psychological wounds. The official investigation into her unauthorized mission concluded that while Chief Dalton had technically violated numerous regulations, the successful rescue of Lieutenant Archer and the capture of a traitor who'd compromised multiple operations warranted recognition rather than punishment. The recommendation for the Silver Star moved through channels with unusual speed. Normally, such awards took months or years to process. But something about Kira's mission had captured attention at the highest levels. Perhaps it was the tactical brilliance of the operation. Perhaps it was the sheer audacity of a solo rescue across 127 miles. Or perhaps it was simply that, in a war that often felt morally ambiguous, where victory was measured in increments too small to celebrate, Kira's mission represented something pure, a promise kept, a teammate brought home, a reminder of the values that made the sacrifice worthwhile. Colonel Thornton retired 6 months after the rescue. His final duty assignment was to help implement new policies regarding gender integration in special operations training. He worked tirelessly to ensure that evaluation standards remained high, but that artificial barriers based on outdated assumptions were eliminated. It was, he told people, his attempt to atone for 40 years of being part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Lieutenant Archer recovered fully and returned to active duty with SEAL Team. He carried 2 photos in his gear, one of his wife and daughter, one of Chief Kira Dalton, taken on the day she'd walked through the gate carrying him. He told every new SEAL who joined his team about the Marine who'd refused to let him die alone in an Iraqi prison. And he made sure they understood that the lesson wasn't just about courage or skill, but about the obligation to bring everyone home, regardless of what arbitrary standards suggested was possible. 1 year after the rescue, Chief Kira Dalton stood at attention in the parade ground at Marine Corps Base Quantico, Virginia. The ceremony was formal, attended by over 500 Marines and SEALs, all in their dress uniforms, all gathered to witness something that happened rarely enough to be special, but not so rarely that it lost meaning: the Silver Star presentation. General Marcus Hartwell, commanding general of Marine Forces, stood at the podium reading the citation. His voice carried across the parade ground, amplified by speakers, but strong enough that amplification barely seemed necessary. The President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Silver Star Medal to Chief Gunnery Sergeant Kira Dalton, United States Marine Corps, for service as set forth in the following: for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States while serving with Marine Forces Iraq. On the night of April 14th, Chief Dalton conducted a solo infiltration operation across 127 miles of hostile territory to rescue a captured United States Navy SEAL officer. Displaying exceptional courage and tactical brilliance, she infiltrated a fortified insurgent compound, eliminated 5 enemy combatants, and extracted the wounded officer under fire. During the subsequent exfiltration, Chief Dalton navigated a marked minefield while carrying the injured officer, successfully crossing terrain that conventional forces had declared impassable. Her actions directly resulted in the recovery of vital intelligence and the arrest of a traitor who had compromised multiple operations. Chief Dalton's exceptional leadership, tactical acumen, and unwavering commitment to bringing home a fellow service member reflect great credit upon herself and uphold the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service. The crowd erupted in applause, not the polite recognition typically given at military ceremonies, but a genuine outpouring of respect from warriors who understood exactly what those dry, official words meant. Kira stood at attention, her face expressionless, her eyes forward, maintaining the perfect military bearing that had been drilled into her over a decade of service. But when the general mentioned Lieutenant Archer by name, when he spoke specifically about bringing a teammate home, her jaw tightened slightly. Just a fraction, just enough for those who knew her to recognize the emotion beneath the professional exterior. Colonel Victor Thornton stepped forward to pin the silver star on her chest. At 68 now, officially retired but present in his dress blue uniform with 4 decades of ribbons, he represented everything she'd had to overcome to stand here. The old guard, the traditional standards, the assumption that certain people couldn't do certain things. As he pinned the medal, he whispered something only she could hear. "You made me proud, Marine, and you made me better." She whispered back, her voice barely audible but certain. "Thank you for trusting me when it mattered, Colonel." The ceremony concluded with traditional military precision. The assembled crowd stood at attention. The national anthem played, the flag snapped in the Virginia breeze, and Chief Gunnery Sergeant Kira Dalton stood as living proof that excellence transcended every artificial barrier humans created. After the formal ceremony ended, the crowd broke into smaller groups. SEALs clustered around Lieutenant Archer, who'd attended in his dress white uniform with his wife and 18-month-old daughter. Emma Kira Archer wore a tiny shirt that said, "Auntie Kira," and kept reaching toward the shiny medal on Kira's chest, with the single-minded determination of a toddler who decided something was interesting. "She takes after you," Archer told Kira with a smile. "Sees something she wants and refuses to quit until she gets it." Kira held Emma carefully, mindful of the child's fragility compared to the weapons and equipment she usually handled. Emma grabbed the silver star and made satisfied noises. "She's perfect," Kira said softly. "She exists because you walk through hell," Archer's wife Jennifer said quietly. Her eyes were bright with tears. "I'll never be able to thank you enough for giving my daughter her father." The informal reception that followed was held in one of the base's conference halls. It was technically a professional gathering, but the atmosphere was more like a reunion. SEALs and Marines who'd served with Kira or Archer over the years had traveled from across the country to attend. Even Commander Blackwell had made the trip from Iraq, where he was still serving as the Senior Special Operations Officer at FOB Whiskey. Midway through the reception, Colonel Thornton approached the microphone. The room gradually quieted as people realized he wanted to speak. This wasn't part of the official program, but no one objected. Thornton had earned the right to speak whenever he wanted. "I'm going to tell you something I've never admitted publicly," he began, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in uniform. "When Chief Dalton came to me 72 hours after Lieutenant Archer's capture and told me she was going to attempt a solo rescue, my first instinct was to stop her. Not because the mission was tactically unsound, not because the odds were impossible, but because I didn't believe a woman could do what she was proposing." The room went completely silent. This was the kind of honest admission that ended careers, that destroyed reputations, that violated the unwritten rule that leaders never reveal their prejudices. "I spent 40 years training Marines, teaching them that perfect technique beats physical strength, that determination beats size, that skill beats luck. But I had blind spots. I believed that certain people couldn't do certain things based on demographics rather than demonstrated capability. I believed that women, regardless of their training or determination, lack something essential for the most difficult missions." He paused, looking directly at Kira. "Chief Dalton proved me wrong. She didn't just complete the mission. She did something I couldn't have done in my prime, something that most of the men in this room couldn't do. She redefined what we thought was possible, and in doing so, she showed me that excellence has no gender, that the only things that matter are the heart that refuses to quit and the skill to back up that determination." He turned to address the full room. "I'm telling you this because I know I'm not alone. I know that many of you, maybe most of you, have the same blind spots I had, the same assumptions about what different people can and can't do. And I'm telling you that those assumptions are wrong. They're morally wrong because they deny opportunity to people who've earned it, and they're tactically wrong because they prevent us from utilizing our most capable personnel." His voice hardened with conviction. So I'm going to spend whatever time I have left making sure that no other Marine has to prove themselves the way Chief Dalton did. That no other warrior has to walk 127 miles through hell just to be recognized as an equal. Because that's not just unjust, it's wasteful of our most precious resource. The men and women who volunteer to serve, who train to excellence, who refuse to quit no matter the odds. He raised his glass in salute. To Chief Gunnery Sergeant Kira Dalton, the finest Marine I ever trained, and to the lessons she taught all of us about having the courage to confront our own prejudices and become better than we were. The room erupted in applause. Not polite ceremony applause, but the genuine recognition of warriors who understood that Thornton had just done something as difficult in its own way as Kira's mission. He'd admitted fault publicly, he'd acknowledged prejudice and committed to change. And he'd used his considerable reputation to advocate for a better future. Kira stood and walked to where Thornton stood by the microphone. For a moment, they faced each other. Teacher and student, two generations of warriors, the old guard and the new. Then Kira came to attention and rendered the sharpest salute of her career. Thornton returned it with equal precision, and as their hands dropped, he extended his right hand for a handshake that carried 4 decades of military tradition. She took it, and in that grip, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, because she'd never held his prejudice against him, but understanding, acknowledgement that people could change, that mistakes could be redeemed through action and commitment. The reception continued late into the evening, stories being shared and bonds being strengthened. But eventually, people began to drift away, returning to their units and their families and their lives. The war continued. Other missions waited. The world kept turning, regardless of individual moments of triumph or recognition. 3 days after the ceremony, Kira reported to her new duty assignment. She'd been promoted to gunnery sergeant and assigned as the head instructor for the Scout Sniper School at Quantico. It was the position Colonel Thornton had held for 5 years before his retirement. The position that shaped the next generation of Marine snipers. The position that would allow her to ensure that the standards remained high, but that the barriers remained appropriate. Her first day as head instructor, she stood in front of 43 students, 39 men and 4 women. All of them had graduated from basic infantry training. All of them had volunteered for one of the most demanding schools in the military. All of them believed they had what it took to become Marine Scout snipers. Most of them would fail. That was the nature of special operations training. The standards were high because the missions required excellence. But Kira was determined that those who failed would fail because they couldn't meet the standard, not because artificial barriers made the standard impossible to reach. "My name is Gunnery Sergeant Kira Dalton," she began, her voice carrying across the range. "Some of you may have heard stories about me. Some of those stories are true. Some are exaggerated. Some are complete fabrications. None of them matter. What matters is whether you can meet the standard required to graduate from this school." She paced along the line of students, making eye contact with each one. That standard is high, higher than most schools in the military. We maintain that standard because Marine Scout snipers operate in conditions where failure means death. Your death, your teammates' death, mission failure that costs lives. She stopped at the center of the formation. But that standard is also fair. It's based on demonstrated capability, not on assumptions about what different people can or can't do. You'll all face the same qualifications, the same tests, the same evaluations, and you'll pass or fail based solely on your performance. One of the male students raised his hand. Kira nodded for him to speak. "Gunnery Sergeant, is it true you walked 127 miles through enemy territory to rescue a SEAL officer?" Kira considered the question, the real question underneath it. Are the stories true? Can someone like you really do what they say you did? Are you actually qualified to teach us? "Yes," she said simply, But that's not why I'm qualified to teach this course. I'm qualified because I've spent 10 years perfecting the skills we're going to teach you. Because I've operated in combat conditions and know what works and what gets you killed. And because I refuse to pass students who don't meet the standard or fail students who do meet it based on anything except their demonstrated performance. She pulled out her M40A6 rifle, the same weapon she'd carried through Iraq, now cleaned and maintained, but still bearing the scars of that mission. This weapon is capable of first-round hits at distances exceeding 1,000 yards. But the weapon doesn't make the shot. The shooter makes the shot. Through thousands of hours of training, through perfect technique and mental discipline, through the ability to function when your hands are shaking and your vision is blurred and every instinct is screaming at you to quit. She sat up behind the rifle in a perfect prone position. So let me show you what's possible when skill meets determination meets absolute refusal to accept failure. The target was positioned at 1,200 yards. Wind was gusting at 15 miles per hour, conditions that made accuracy difficult even for experienced shooters. She settled behind the scope, ran the calculations, compensated for every variable, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth precision that came from 10,000 repetitions. The target rocked backward from the impact, perfect center mass. She stood and faced the students. That's the standard. Not because I made that shot, but because that's what's required in combat when lives depend on your accuracy. Some of you will reach that standard, many of you won't, but everyone will get the opportunity to try based solely on your capability and determination. The training began the next day. It was brutal by design. Long-range shooting, navigation, camouflage, stalking, physical fitness, mental resilience. Everything required to operate as a Marine Scout sniper in the most demanding conditions imaginable. Students dropped out regularly, usually within the first 2 weeks, when the physical demands exceeded their capacity. But Kira noticed something interesting. The 4 female students weren't dropping out at higher rates than the males. In fact, one of them, Lance Corporal Sarah Mitchell, was consistently scoring in the top 5 across all evaluations. She was smaller than most of the male students, but she compensated with perfect technique and a determination that reminded Kira of herself a decade ago. After 3 weeks of training during a long-range shooting evaluation, Lance Corporal Mitchell made a 1,247-yard shot in conditions that Kira had specifically designed to be exceptionally difficult. The same shot Kira had made in 2004, the shot that Thornton had dismissed as luck. Kira walked down to the shooting position and found Mitchell breaking down her rifle with methodical precision. "That was an exceptional shot, Lance Corporal." Mitchell looked up, clearly uncertain whether she was about to receive praise or criticism. "Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant. Colonel Thornton told me I got lucky with the win when I made that same shot a decade ago." Kira's voice was matter-of-fact. But it wasn't luck. It was preparation meeting opportunity. It was thousands of hours of training creating the capability to perform under conditions where most people would fail. She crouched down to look Mitchell in the eye. "You're going to face people who dismiss your achievements as luck, who assume that your success is an anomaly rather than the result of skill and determination. Don't waste energy arguing with them. Just keep performing. Keep exceeding the standard. Eventually, the evidence becomes overwhelming." Mitchell nodded, understanding passing between 2 women who'd walked similar paths, separated by a decade. "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant, I won't let you down. You're not doing this for me, Lance Corporal. You're doing it for yourself, for the Marines you'll serve with, for the mission that will someday depend on your skills, and for every woman who'll come after you, who'll have an easier path because you proved it was possible." The months passed. The class graduated 18 students out of the original 43. 3 of the 4 female students graduated, including Lance Corporal Mitchell, who finished second in the class overall. The graduation ceremony was smaller than Kira's Silver Star presentation, but in some ways more significant. These 18 Marines would go on to serve as scout snipers, operating in the most dangerous conditions, making the shots that mattered most. And 3 of them were women who'd proven, beyond any doubt, that gender had nothing to do with capability. Colonel Thornton attended the graduation, still in his role as an advocate for reform, and as someone who wanted to witness the changes he'd helped implement. After the ceremony, he found Kira at the range, where she was already preparing for the next class. "You're doing important work here, Gunny," he said, using the informal address that marked genuine respect rather than formal hierarchy. "Just maintaining the standard, sir, like you taught me. I taught you technique, but you figured out the most important lesson on your own." He gestured toward the departing students. "That excellence transcends every artificial barrier we create. That the only thing that matters is whether someone can do the job." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the range where generations of Marines had learned the ancient art of precision shooting. Finally, Thornton spoke again. "I've been thinking about your mission, about what you accomplished, and I realized something. You didn't just rescue Lieutenant Archer, you rescued all of us from our own limitations, from the prejudices that prevented us from seeing what was possible." Kira considered that, then shook her head slightly. "With respect, sir, I didn't rescue anyone from anything. I just did my job. The rest of you decided what lesson to take from it. That's on you, not me." Thornton smiled. "Still gracious even when you've earned the right to be proud. That's another lesson you're teaching, Gunny. How to handle success without arrogance. How to break barriers without bitterness. Someone once told me that the odds didn't matter, that what mattered was the promise we make to bring everyone home." She looked at him directly. "You gave me the map that let me keep that promise. So thank you, Colonel, for trusting me when it counted. Thank you for being worthy of that trust." He saluted her formally, a gesture that reversed their positions from a decade ago when she'd been the student and he'd been the instructor. She returned it with equal precision. Then he walked away, leaving her alone on the range with the rifle and the targets and the knowledge that her mission wasn't complete. It would never be complete. Because the work of proving that excellence had no barriers wasn't done by one person or one mission. It was done by thousands of small actions over years and decades, gradually shifting understanding until the old prejudices became historical curiosities rather than operational realities. 5 years after the rescue, Kira attended Lieutenant Brennan Archer's promotion ceremony. He was now Lieutenant Commander Archer, still serving with the SEALs, still leading men into impossible situations and bringing them home. His daughter Emma was now 6 years old, bright and curious, and already showing signs of her father's determination. After the ceremony, Emma ran up to Kira with the uncomplicated affection of a child who'd grown up hearing stories about her namesake. "Auntie Kira, did you really walk through a minefield carrying my daddy?" Kira crouched down to Emma's level, smiling at the directness of the question. "I did. It was scary and dangerous, and I don't recommend trying it at home. Daddy says you're the bravest person he ever met." "Your daddy is pretty brave himself. He's the one who taught me that Marines and SEALs always bring each other home, no matter what." Emma considered this with the seriousness of someone for whom the concept of danger was still mostly theoretical. "When I grow up, I want to be brave like you and Daddy." Kira felt her throat tighten. This child, who existed because one Marine had refused to accept that some missions were impossible, was already thinking about courage and service, already understanding that some things were worth fighting for. "Then be brave, Emma. Be brave and kind, and never let anyone tell you that you can't do something just because of who you are. Be brave enough to prove them wrong, just like your daddy does every day." Emma hugged her with the fierce certainty of a child who decided that Kira was someone worth hugging. And as Kira returned that embrace, she thought about the long chain of choices that had led to this moment. The decision to become a sniper against the advice of people who said women couldn't do it. The decision to attempt a rescue that every regulation said was impossible. The decision to walk through hell because a promise mattered more than safety. And she thought about all the Emmas who would grow up in a world where their capabilities were judged by their actions rather than their demographics, where courage and skill mattered more than conformity to traditional expectations, where the barriers were lower because people like her had been willing to climb them first. That evening, back at her quarters on Quantico, Kira sat cleaning her rifle with the meditative precision that came from years of repetition. The M40A6 had been with her through 3 deployments, through thousands of rounds fired in training and combat, through that impossible mission in Iraq that had redefined what people thought was possible. On her desk sat 3 items that told the story of that mission. The silver star in its presentation case, the sealed trident that Garrett Sutton had given her, and a photo of her standing at the FOB whiskey gate, covered in blood and dust and exhaustion, having just completed a mission that would become legend. But the item she valued most was something that never left her person, a small compass that her father had carried through his Marine career. He'd given it to her shortly before his death, telling her that as long as she had it, she'd never lose her way. She'd carried it through every mission, through every training exercise, through that long walk across 127 miles of hostile desert. She pulled it out now, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. The compass still worked perfectly, still pointed true north despite everything it had endured, just like the code that had driven her into that desert. The code that said, "Marines bring everyone home." The code that made promises sacred and obligations absolute. Tomorrow she'd return to the range and train another class of aspiring snipers. Next month, she'd review applications for advanced courses and make recommendations about who was ready and who needed more training. Next year, she'd probably deploy again, putting her skills to use in whatever conflict demanded Marine precision shooters. But tonight, she just sat with her rifle and her compass, and the knowledge that she'd kept a promise that mattered. That Lieutenant Brennan Archer was alive to watch his daughter grow up because one Marine had been willing to walk through hell to bring him home. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. The shadow on the ridge had become something larger than one mission or one person. It had become a reminder that impossible was just another word for not yet attempted. That promises kept in blood and honor mattered more than regulations and acceptable losses. That the code, the ancient, unbreakable code that warriors live by, meant something real and true and worth defending. They'd been writing Lieutenant Archer's eulogy when Chief Kira Dalton appeared on that ridge, carrying her teammate home through sheer force of will and skill and determination that refused to accept defeat. And in that moment, she'd proven something that changed everyone who witnessed it. She'd proven that Marines bring them home. Always, no matter what.